The Sandy Cemeteries podcast is a MindGuard Media podcast in association with
Screw You, Todd
Productions.
The world we live in is ever-changing. We can learn a lot from the dead. I'm Sandy Jean, your host, and this is Sandy Cemeteries, Tracing History. We'll learn about some of the oldest towns in the nation, as well as the interesting people who are buried there. Ready? Let's go. Each and every time I visited historic Oakwood Cemetery in Syracuse, New York, my attention would be drawn to a large mausoleum on a hill on the right side of the main entrance. The Art Deco style mausoleum was tall and quite imposing, and I must admit it took me several visits to Oakwood before I decided to walk up to it and actually check it out. Armed with a K2 meter and complete respect, I approached the beautiful, if somewhat spooky, building. The name on the front above the doors simply said, Brown. There was an old ragged teddy bear in a sweater sitting against the steps of the mausoleum when I was there, which made it just a bit spookier. As the lights on my K2 meter began to blink, and even seemingly in answer to my questions, I realized that I needed to find out everything I could about the Brown family and why they chose to communicate with me. This is their story. Alexander Timothy Brown was born on November 21st, 1854 in Cortland County, New York. The son of Stephen and Nancy Alexander Brown, Mr. Brown moved to Syracuse at the age of 25. Mrs. Mary Siemens Brown was born on August 3, 1863, in Virgil, New York. She was the daughter of Julian C. Siemens and Matilda Ladd Siemens, and was one of 10 children. Her father was a blacksmith and carriage maker. She attended grammar school in Virgil, and in her late teens, on a visit to the home of one of her sisters who was married and living in Syracuse, she met Mr. Brown, who was also a native of Cortland County. They were married on April 2nd of 1883. Alexander became the inventor of the L.C. Smith shotgun, which was a sporting firearm. He later invented the Smith Premier full keyboard upstrike typewriter, which premiered in 1889, and this typewriter allowed the typist to see what was just typed. Now, prior to this, the words were hidden from view. At the age of 48, Mr. Brown was president of the H. Franklin Automobile Company. He was co-founder of Brown Light Chapin, which began by inventing a 2-speed bi-gear for bicycles. Later, they began making 3-speed transmissions for Yellow Cab and Henry Ford. In 1910, they began supplying differentials to the automobile industry. It eventually became the Inland Fisher Guide unit of General Motors. After 1920, Mr. Brown obtained patents for both the automatic telephone, which he sold to the Stromberg-Carlson Company, and the motor-driven harvesting machines. The farm machinery patents developed vehicles capable of turning square corners. He was also a director of the First Trust and Deposit Company and chairman of the Grade Crossing Commission. Mr. Brown died on January 31st, 1929, at the age of 74 from bronchial pneumonia. The many years of Mrs. Brown's married life were devoted primarily to her family and home. She was interested in the Canatana Club, the morning musicals, and the Employment Society. She was a member of the Onondaga and the Bellevue Country Clubs. Mrs. Brown loved Virgil, New York, where she grew up, and at one point furnished and equipped 2 rooms in the Union School there and made memorial gifts and building improvement donations to the Methodist Church, which she had attended in girlhood. Mrs. Brown died on June 22, 1932, at the age of 68 from pneumonia. The couple had 2 sons, Charles Siemens Brown and Julian Stephen Brown. Now, I think this is where we should talk about money and how it affects us and how it's different for everybody. Mr. and Mrs. Brown were millionaires. They had amassed quite a fortune over the years from Alexander's inventions, his investments, and wise business decisions. When Alexander died in the 1920s, a third of his $7 million estate was passed on to Mrs. Brown. Their sons received the other 2/3. Now, to put it in perspective, today, that same $7 million would be the equivalent of almost $100 million. So let's take a look at their sons, Charles and Julian, and see what happened next. Charles Brown, or Charlie as he was called, was born in 1885 in Syracuse. After his schooling in Syracuse, Charlie attended Cornell University and graduated in engineering in the class of 1907. Charlie eventually patented a power mowing machine for cutting roadside and ditchside grass. The rights were assigned to the Revere Copper and Brass Tractor Division in Rome, New York. Charlie was also a very good freehand artist, and his father Alexander also thought that he should become a concert violinist. Now, Charlie did master the violin, but never followed through publicly, whether amateur or professional. He did become the possessor of a Stradivarius violin in his later years and occasionally played at home. Charlie married Iola G. Warrior from Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1936, and the couple had not only a family home on James Street in Syracuse, but also a country residence called Zandarina at Shackleton Point on Oneida Lake near Bridgeport, New York. Charlie died in 1953 from a heart attack. Now let's talk about Julian. Julian Stephen Brown was born in 1887 and led quite an interesting life. I think the best way to sum up Julian's life is to quote his obituary. Quote, Julian S. Brown, 77, of Daytona Beach, Florida, formerly of Syracuse, New York, died Saturday night, April 4, 1964, in Daytona Beach after a short illness. A native of Syracuse, he resided here until moving to Florida 7 years ago. Mr. Brown inherited $3.5 million from the estate of his father, Alexander T. Brown, at the time of his death in the late 1920s, and of his mother, Mrs. Mary L. Brown, a few years later. For more than a quarter of a century, Mr. Brown was involved in court proceedings stemming from 4 marriages and embroilment in bankruptcy claims. Coming into an inheritance from the estate of his father about the time of the beginning of the Depression, Brown entered into a series of ventures, including the construction of a nightclub at State Street and Erie Boulevard that failed. He inherited a $500,000 trust fund from his mother, contested the will, settled for the $500,000, and then lost most of it in payment to creditors. An inventor, Mr. Brown built a battery-powered electric motor for fishing boats that enjoyed a moderate success. He at one time pursued a lengthy investigation that resulted in the calculation that there were 50,000 lakes in the United States, most of them in Florida. Now, Julian Brown was married 4 times to Ethel Listman from 1911 to 1917. They were divorced in Michigan. To Margaret A. Hanna, married in 1922, divorced in Mexico in 1932. Mary Alice Rambo, they were married in 1936. It was annulled in 1937. And his final wife was Marjorie Bass Gibbons. They were married in 1939. Well, there you have it. 2 brothers with a large inheritance, each going a separate way in life. I feel as if Julian's story is almost comical in a way, and at the very least, might make a good movie. Both sons are buried with their parents in the Brown family mausoleum, as is Charlie's wife Iola. The Brown family home, built in 1895, is located at 726 West Onondaga Street in Syracuse. It's listed on the National Register of Historic Places. History is a fascinating thing. I can honestly say that without my visit to the Brown Mausoleum in Oakwood Cemetery in Syracuse, New York, and their willingness to communicate with me, I might never have learned the story of this amazing, very interesting family of inventors, philanthropists, artists, and, well, Juliet. Each and every one of us deserves that our stories be told and kept alive long after we have passed on to wherever it is we go. And that's why I will continue to research and learn and connect with the past. Check out our other podcasts, the Sandy and Toddcast and the Empathicary podcast, on any of the platforms that you normally find your podcasts, including YouTube and Twitter. Be sure to like the Sandy and Toddcast on Facebook to keep up on the latest goings-on, including each week's new episode. You can also join our group Stay Weirdos Friends of the Sandy and Toddcast for more fun. We're like a big family there. It's a safe place to share your thoughts, feelings, ideas, and random inappropriate memes without judgment.
We make podcasting easy. Mind Garden Media can get you going on your very own podcast. With many years in the broadcast and audio industry, Mind Garden Media can edit, fully produce, and provide all the web distribution services. We're podcasters too, so we'll guide you every step of the way to a professional sounding podcast production. For information, email the Mind Garden Media at gmail.com. The Mind Garden Media at gmail.com. Or check us out on Facebook.